In this lecture, we'll be considering the inheritance of 19th century ideas and the legacy that they would have for the 20th century. In our previous lecture, we had discussed an explanatory framework, we had defined utopia and terror, and discussed key elements of the ideological regimes that we'll be discussing in our later lectures. What we'd like to do today is to look back at the pre-existing conditions of the 20th century, look back to the 19th century and its ideas and characteristic frames of mind. Because the ideas that were launched in the 19th century and certain philosophies and ideologies would continue to work themselves out through the following century, would form a very important legacy. In speaking about the dynamic processes underway in the 19th century, it's justified to speak of a dual revolution. And centuries don't always oblige us by neatly demarking historical processes. So we need, in fact, to look at the very start of the 19th century and just before it, at the late 18th century, for the origins of this dual revolution. Starting in the late 18th century and then working itself out through the course of the 19th century, this dual revolution would have consequences that are still with us today. An unfolding political revolution, on the one hand, often linked with and joined to a continuing industrial revolution, which we're arguably still in. Confidence engendered by these upheavals and all that the dual revolution promised gave support to a crucial idea of Western civilization, the idea of progress. Progress with a capital P. Progress implying the onward march of constant and perhaps ultimately inevitable betterment, bringing about improvement and unceasing change for the better in civilization. We need first to consider the political element of this dual revolution. In politics, the American and French revolutions at the end of the 18th century launched new and continuing experiments in popular government that echoed throughout the 19th century. Advances in industry, also starting in the 18th century, produced dramatic transformation in the ordinary lives of people in the course of the 19th century and gave, incidentally, immense prestige to the science that seemed to have achieved those changes and improvements. Together, the political revolution and the economic or industrial expanded as a whole the sense of what was possible for all human beings, for ordinary individuals, what their lives might have in store for them if progress continued. Let's consider first the political revolution, what we might term the political revolution of the masses, because it brought in a new player into politics, the notion of popular sovereignty, masses of people, in which individuals could now seek to find a voice. The background for the political revolution were certainly the ideas of the Enlightenment. At the end of the 18th century, as revolutions broke out, 1776 in the American colonies, in 1789 in France, they were often informed by Enlightenment ideas. Now, let's make no mistake about this. Each of these events had their own disparate and immediate causes. But nonetheless, the new ideas of the Enlightenment informed the thinking of many of the revolutionaries who saw themselves being given, in this time of change, a chance to realize some of their cherished Enlightenment ideals. The Enlightenment was, in brief, an 18th century movement in Western civilization stressing the values above all of reason. These included scientific inquiry, a certain skeptical outlook that didn't take things simply on faith. Implied in this also was religious toleration as an ideal, not seeking to impose in a blind or fanatical way one's own beliefs, but rather testing them against reason in free, unfettered debate. Also a certain secularism or an exclusion of total ideological or religious claims from the public square. The values of innovation, holding that change could be good if it brought human existence into line with reason, and a key notion of the Enlightenment, reform. Reason could reform our lives, our politics, our beliefs, our society. Thinkers like Voltaire urged this message. However, a newer generation of writers succeeding upon Voltaire pushed these ideas further in perhaps more radical directions. They included writers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who in his masterpiece, The Social Contract in 1762, argued that reason commanded a crucial political implication: the legitimacy of popular sovereignty, not the rule of kings or queens, but rather the people, this abstraction or this reality, ruling themselves, and the only legitimate form of true democratic and authorized government. The Enlightenment's optimism for reform, for progress, and also for human perfectibility generated tremendous excitement and a sense of possibilities. One needs to take in for a moment just how outrageous this belief could be. Human perfectibility meant that if human life could be brought into line with reason, there was no limit to what might be achieved in terms of the perfection of mankind itself. The revolutions, thus, in the Americas and in France at the end of the 18th century evoked enthusiastic reactions far beyond the borders of those countries. The American Revolution was hailed as a chance to enact Enlightenment ideas. Excited observers in Europe felt that something truly new was taking place, meriting the world's attention. And in fact, one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the American War for Independence was the British political agitator and Enlightenment philosophe Thomas Paine, who celebrated the American events as he put it, a new start for the world, a chance to begin creation again and to get it right this time by bringing human existence into line with reason. Thomas Paine argued that there was no going back. Once people had seen what popular sovereignty could mean and be, it wouldn't be possible to unthink what the American Revolution had demonstrated was a possibility for all mankind. A universal message, he argued, was being announced. Now we need to speak about a revolution taking place in old Europe, the French Revolution. Though there were similarities and very clear intellectual links between the American and the French Revolution, they were also very different, in part because the French Revolution soon took on a more violent and radical turn, which is very important in terms of its intellectual impact as well. The French Revolution's events were unleashed starting in 1789 when the monarch of France, King Louis XVI, called together an Estates General, a parliamentary or representative body, a traditional body, that he hoped would authorize new fiscal reforms to put France on a firm footing in terms of taxation. He hoped that they would approve his plans for fiscal reforms, but instead he discovered that the Estates General rapidly developed a momentum of their own. The representatives of not only the aristocracy or of the clerics, but also the representatives of the common orders of France who had been gathered together at the Estates General soon formed their own ideas about their mission. They gained a new confidence, a new sense of identity politically, and started making new demands that went far beyond what the monarch had felt was legitimate. These representatives declared themselves to be a national assembly, representing the people, national, and resolved to write a constitution that would enact these reforms. When the king, in his irresolute way, tried to halt them, a new force intervened. The Paris mob stormed the Bastille royal fortress on July 14th, 1789. And though this was not a strategically decisive event, nonetheless, symbolically it was significant. The crowds had gathered and had stormed a symbol of royal authority, and to a great extent had brought down the confidence of that royal authority along with the structure that they demolished, freeing the prisoners found therein. For Elias Canetti, the analyst of crowds, whom we discussed in the first lecture, this would be a crucial, perhaps the initial entry of the modern mass or the modern crowd into politics. The National Assembly now moved in a remarkable summer of 1789 to enact one after another ringing declaration of new rights. In August 1789, the National Assembly issued what it called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And here we see a certain consonance between the American Revolution as well as the French, because these are ideas that had been affected by the American declarations. The revolutionaries, however, venturing now on the route of radical reforms, faced opposition elsewhere in Europe and even on the borders of France, as the crowned heads of Europe looked with great suspicion at the radicalism that seemed to be growing in the once great kingdom of France. The revolutionaries, feeling threatened, moved now to a more radical phase. In 1792, they declared a French republic, abolishing the monarchy and now instead instituting popular sovereignty. According to many historians, this was the advent of a new, modern kind of politics with appeals not just to elites, not just to notions of divine right as legitimacy, but rather modern appeals to the masses and the legitimacy that only the people gathered together supposedly could give. The revolutionaries' slogans were in many cases informed by the ideals of the Enlightenment. They were the ringing slogans of liberty, equality, and fraternity, universal ideals for all mankind. This emphasis on freedom and individual human rights grew into the ideology of classical liberalism. We see here the beginning of the age of ideologies in the modern period. At the same time, another ideology was born as well, the appeals to the people and the attempt to muster the French people out of loyalty to not the king, but to the French fatherland, showed the new power of nationalism, especially in events such as the universal mobilization of the nation, the mass drafting of the population at large in 1793, all of which showed the new power of this new allied ideology of nationalism. Both liberalism and nationalism would play crucial and at first linked roles in 19th century history. There was also another element that we need to explore a little bit further in the events of the French Revolution, and this was a certain utopianism, which was present in the increasingly radical dynamic of the French Revolution, especially in its most radical. And this is a feature of the French Revolution that some historians believe sets it apart from the American experience. The ardent, radical revolutionaries sought at their most radical to de-Christianize France, replacing religion with a cult of reason and Enlightenment ideas, so that the Cathedral of Notre Dame, for instance, would be emptied of its traditional Christian paraphernalia and instead would become a temple to reason. In a very vivid symbol of the new arrival of a new age, the revolutionaries also instituted a new revolutionary calendar, which expressed an epochal break that the revolutionaries were seeking in human existence, which reformed months and weeks into a more rational and Enlightenment-minded chronological framework, doing away with a massive traditional accretion of religious holidays and saints' days that earlier had been the case. As the French Revolution moved into a more radical phase, however, its promises started to exact a price in blood, in what has come to be known as the Reign of Terror. Fearing for the survival of the revolution, surrounded as it was by enemies on the outside, and revolutionaries feared enemies within as well, in 1793 they executed the king and established a new governing body that would lead the revolution on to a final victory, known as the Committee of Public Safety. The Committee of Public Safety ushered in a policy that was known as the Terror, lasting from 1793 to 1794 at its height. The Committee of Public Safety and the Terror were both dominated by an intriguing figure, in many ways a frightening figure, the lawyer Maximilien Robespierre. Maximilien Robespierre has been considered one of the prime and original examples of the intellectual in politics. His nickname among contemporaries was the Incorruptible One. He was frightening to contemporaries because he wasn't in it for personal power or for personal gain, so it seemed, but rather out of a commitment to abstract ideals which he sought to realize. Maximilien Robespierre deliberately advocated revolutionary terror. Revolutionary terror was defined as prompt and total justice, unsparing and unrelenting. The prize of this policy of revolutionary terror was the production of what was called a republic of virtue. Someday, after a period of terror, it was judged, it would no longer be necessary to use compulsion because people of their own, of their innate virtue that had been brought to the fore, would do the right thing without being compelled to do so. Robespierre ringingly announced that terror without virtue was merely evil. Virtue without terror at this stage of history would be pathetic and weak. Terror, he felt, was necessary. It is attributed to Robespierre, this saying that one cannot make an omelet without breaking eggs. The ends, glorious as they were, would seem to justify the means for Robespierre. Terror would be necessary to bring about the Republic of Virtue. And there was one particular tool which would be used in the persecutions and executions of the Reign of Terror, which in a perverted way seemed to sum up the ideals of the Enlightenment in ways that would have horrified earlier Enlightenment philosophers. This was a machine called the guillotine. It was developed by Dr. Guillotin. It was a scientific execution device. It was considered to be sleek, modern, efficient, hygienic as well, and humane in its execution of its victims. A massive blade, which was set in a set of tracks mounted above the body of the intended victim, would come crashing down instantaneously, and it was said humanely, painlessly almost, severing the head of the victim of the terror from his body. This machine, along with other persecutions, took an estimated 50,000 lives in the course of the Reign of Terror. These numbers, as we'll see, 50,000, bad as they were, would later be dwarfed in the course of the 20th century. The radicals of the French Revolution, often called Jacobins, were proud of accepting the label of terrorists. Terror was their policy. It showed their determination and their will, and they were glad to accept that label. It was a label that the thinker Edmund Burke, considered one of the fathers of modern conservatism, would turn against these radicals and turn increasingly into the term of stigma that we are acquainted with in our current usage today. This terror, increasing in its radicalism, ultimately burned itself out. Robespierre, the incorruptible one, was ultimately betrayed by some of his own associates who feared that they perhaps were next in his campaigns for purity of revolutionary purpose, and that they might be suspected of insufficient rigor and commitment. They had him arrested and then executed in 1794. In a bitter turn of events, the French Revolution ultimately ended not in the realization of the Republic of Virtue, but rather in a far more absolute despotism of Napoleon Bonaparte, a child of the French Revolution thrown up by this crisis, whose military dictatorship led France onto the route of empire. The French Revolution obviously opened up vast questions. What had gone wrong? How could the events have taken the course that they did, ultimately leading to failure? The one revolutionary by the name of Saint-Just delivered a statement which seemed to be a very accurate depiction of how events had unfolded. He called the revolution a mother who devours her children. And so indeed it had been. The dynamic of the French Revolution and its increasing radicalism had taken a toll not only of those who opposed the French Revolution or who were suspected of split loyalties, but even of true believers in the cause itself. In spite of its failures and excesses, however, which were discussed in the course of the 19th century, the French Revolution nonetheless, precisely because of those ideals that had been held out in such a compelling form, breaking with earlier traditions, provided throughout the 19th century a powerful and attractive model for those who desired change and looked to radical transformation. In a very real sense, the French Revolution set the terms for the political conflicts of the 19th century. The French Revolution and its commitment to popular sovereignty represented a challenge that opened a new and modern political age. Its challenge would have to be met. There was no way of turning the clock back. Politics from now on would increasingly have to appeal to the masses, or that abstraction of the people, for legitimacy. We need now to turn to an examination of that other dual half of this revolution, the Industrial Revolution of machines. From the 18th century and accelerating in the course of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had profound consequences at least as profound, maybe more so, than the political dramas we've discussed. Now, in fact, the processes that we very neatly as historians call the Industrial Revolution were not only new machines or new technology, but also, more subtly, new ways of organizing work, new social disciplines that were most useful to the new factory environments of the Industrial Revolution. Time is money, for instance. A new governing principle that still rules our lives today all too frequently was a signal of this transformation. But the effects of the Industrial Revolution were markedly uneven. Geographically, they began first of all in northwestern Europe, in Britain and in France, then spread through the rest of the European continent, though there unevenly as well, and then to the United States, and in our own times, to the rest of the world with a seemingly irresistible dynamic and force. Industrialization had very important consequences for society and politics. It remade the physical landscapes of Europe in the course often of one generation of tremendous upheaval and change. First, the landscapes of Europe, later of other parts of the globe, and often disrupted traditional ways of life. The movers and the shakers of the Industrial Revolution were not figures, sole individuals like Robespierre, but rather a kind of individual, the engineer. One can imagine mothers of middle-class sons wishing that their sons would become engineers in these dramatic days of the Industrial Revolution, because the cult of the heroic engineer rose up worldwide. Engineers were those who reshaped the physical world. And this cult of the heroic engineer celebrated their very visible achievements: the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, the American Transcontinental Railroad. At the start of the 20th century, Henry Ford, a Michigan mechanic and engineer, became worldwide an emblem of trust in science and technology. Such idealization of Henry Ford also ignored some of his uglier beliefs. But at the same time, Henry Ford's Model T automobile, developed in 1909 and soon mass-produced with assembly line techniques, showed new possibilities of scientific management and engineering. Social critics raised anxieties about the human effects of this mechanization, this speeding up of our lives. Some of the remedies that were proposed for this, including Coca-Cola, by the way, as a brain tonic that was supposed to help us deal with a more fevered pace of our current lives, I would suspect, given the caffeine content of that drink, might have made matters worse rather than better. But at the same time, even as these anxieties about the increased pace of our lives were abroad, great hopes were also vested in technology's ability to solve those problems through vast, gigantic technological or industrial projects to solve human problems. At the same time, there were thinkers who proposed sciences of the masses to deal with these problems. The two revolutions in politics and in industry, which we've discussed, produced a new world oriented towards the masses. This included the media, the newspapers, including irresponsible yellow journalism, movies, later radio and television, throve on entertaining and informing the masses. In politics, parties had to appeal now to mass constituencies to master their votes in parliamentary systems. In the 20th century, in Western societies, visions of what the future could bring for ordinary people had expanded enormously, leading to a revolution in expectations which politics needed to address. Science in this context had immense allure and prestige. For some individuals, it could in fact take the place of traditional religious belief. It seemed that science might be able to solve society's contradictions. Evolutionary thought, in particular, promised new understandings of progress. The British scientist Charles Darwin, who published his work on the origin of species in 1859, had suggested that the progressive adaptation of creatures to their environment and its challenges produced the phenomenon of evolution, a struggle for survival which led from so-called lower animals to higher, more complex forms. This certainly chimed well with the Victorian ideal of progress, and it suggested that science could also be applied to humans, something that Darwin had been more skeptical about. Inevitably, these ideas in the natural science would be applied by some to humans and their societies in a trend called social Darwinism that often would have horrified Darwin himself. Such social Darwinists approved the energetic application of evolution to human society to encourage, as they put it, the reproduction only of the fittest and the best. Such doctrines would also give support to new, modern varieties of racism, not the sort of ethnic animosity that unfortunately is universal in human experience, but rather a supposedly scientific racism, which would rank mankind into a hierarchy of unequal races, and which would endow an earlier traditional anti-Semitism founded on religious hatred of the Jews into what historians now call a biological anti-Semitism, a hatred of the Jews as a supposed other in biological terms. At the same time, the importance of ideas seeking to cope with the challenges of industrial society found an answer, so it seemed, in one idea, that of socialism. It has been called one of the most important modern ideas of mankind. I think that's a fair description. A different imagined future was offered by socialists, based not on competition, as endorsed by the social Darwinists, but rather on cooperation in future societies without private property. Some reformers, who were often called utopian socialists because of their expectation of a utopia, established real settlements and real communes to serve as models for the rest of mankind for a harmonious society. And some of them were right here in the United States. For instance, Robert Owen's New Harmony settlement that throve, at least for a time, in Indiana in the 1820s. There were other thinkers who also played a very important role in this genealogy of what were called utopian socialists. One of the most important was the French socialist Henri de Saint-Simon, who foresaw a future society of harmony, not necessarily of perfect equality, because this would be a cooperative society presided over by an elite of intellectuals and technological experts who would steer that society in the desired direction. There was, in fact, one particular symbol of the Saint-Simonian project which sought to show just how much human experience would be changed. And one can, in fact, see how vivid it would have been as a symbolic representation. It was a particular kind of jacket called the Saint-Simonian jacket, which could only be buttoned or buckled up from the back. That meant that one individual himself could not properly dress. The Saint-Simonian jacket was by definition one that one would need assistance in putting on. This was supposed to be a symbolically rich illustration and allegory of humanity's need for cooperation. The utopian socialists could also go off in directions that were, to even contemporaries, far more fanciful. The French socialist Charles Fourier advocated cooperative model settlements that he called by the name of phalanosteries. These were supposed to be secular monasteries almost. He also held the most remarkable notions of what the world would be like, including the natural world, with the eventual arrival of the socialist millennium. Not only would human beings learn to cooperate, he hoped, but in this blessed epoch, so too would the natural world and animals. Beasts of prey would learn how to lead vegetarian lives, he hoped. The great animals, whales and elephants, for instance, might join with human beings to cooperate in productive labor willingly, without coercion. Fourier also seems to have believed that the oceans would quite literally turn to lemonade. I'm not really sure how this worked in his vision of socialism, but it seemed part and parcel of the great promise of the arrival of a socialist millennium. But such fanciful notions were not without their critics among contemporaries, and even among other socialists. At roughly the same time, a newer, more potent, and in many ways even more confident and resolute version of this important idea of socialism appeared. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels would announce a break with what they denounced as an unrealistic, fanciful, utopian socialism, and would present their own program of a socialism based more firmly on reality and science. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels would propose what they called a truly scientific socialism, which they claimed was not merely desirable, but which was inevitable, which was of a piece with the logic of the world and human history itself, and which was tantalizingly close to being realized. The outlines of their scientific socialism, as well as disturbing portents, even against this background of the trust and the belief in progress that were current at the end of the 19th century and at the start of the 20th century, will be explored further in our next lecture.